The veteran's quiet life. The soft golden light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of Arthur Hawkins' modest bedroom, gently rousing him from his slumber. At 91 years old, Arthur's body clock was as reliable as ever, waking him just before 6 each morning without fail. He blinked away the remnants of sleep, his weathered hands reaching for the wire-rimmed glasses on his nightstand. As he sat up, his joints protested with familiar creaks and pops. Arthur allowed himself a small grunt, acknowledging the daily reminder of his advanced years. Yet, despite the aches, there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his pale blue eyes. Another day lay ahead, another opportunity to find purpose in the quiet twilight of his life. Arthur's feet found their way into well-worn slippers, and he shuffled towards the kitchen, his hand instinctively reaching for the cane propped against the wall. The house around him was silent, save for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room, a wedding gift from what felt like a lifetime ago. In the kitchen, Arthur went through the motions of his morning routine with practiced ease. He filled the kettle and set it to boil, measuring out precisely 2 swoops of coffee grounds into the French press. As the water heated, he made his way to the front door, joints loosening with each step. The cool morning air greeted him as he opened the door, bringing with it the sense of dewy grass and blooming flowers from his small but meticulously maintained garden. Arthur's eyes scanned the quiet street of Millbrook, the sleepy town he called home for the past 4 decades. Houses with neatly trimmed lawns lined the road, most still dark in the early morning hour. With careful steps, Arthur made his way down the path to retrieve his newspaper. As he bent to pick it up, he noticed Mrs. Thompson from across the street pulling out of her driveway. She gave a friendly wave, which Arthur returned with a nod and a smile. It was a small interaction, but one that reinforced his connection to the community he'd grown to love. Back inside, Arthur poured the now boiling water over the coffee grounds, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. He carried his steaming mug and the newspaper to his favorite armchair by the window, settling in for his daily ritual of current events and reflection. As he unfolded the newspaper, Arthur's eyes were drawn to a headline about veteran affairs. His mind drifted back to his own time in service, images of young men in uniform flashing through his memory. He had served in Korea, a conflict often overshadowed by the wars that came before and after, but one that had left an indelible mark on his life. Arthur's gaze fell on a framed photograph on the side table, a group of young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grins on their faces despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. He was there in the center, barely recognizable as the same person who now sat in this quiet living room. The passage of time never ceased to amaze him. A wave of melancholy washed over Arthur as he thought of the friends he'd lost, both during the war and in the years since. He was the last of his unit still living, a fact that weighed heavily on his heart. Yet, with the sadness came a sense of responsibility, to live well, to remember, and to honor their sacrifices through his own continued service to his community. Arthur's reverie was interrupted by a gentle chime from the clock, signaling 7 o'clock. He carefully folded the newspaper and set it aside, rising from his chair with purpose. It was time to prepare for his volunteer shift at the local Veterans Center. As he dressed in a pressed shirt and slacks, Arthur's mind wandered to the young veterans he would see today. Many were struggling to adjust to civilian life, battling invisible wounds that Arthur understood all too well. He might be long retired from active duty, but he had found a new mission in supporting these men and women who had served their country. Before leaving, Arthur paused at the mirror in the hallway. He straightened his collar and smoothed down his thinning white hair. The face that looked back at him was lined with age, but his eyes still held the same determination and sense of duty that had driven him throughout his life. With his cane in hand, Arthur locked up the house and made his way down the street towards the bus stop. The town was coming to life around him, with people heading to work and children waiting for school buses. Several neighbors called out greetings as he passed, and Arthur responded with warm smiles and nods. The bus ride to the Veterans Center was a familiar journey. Arthur watched the town roll by through the window, Noting the changes that had come over the years, new businesses had opened, old ones had closed, but the heart of Millbrook remained the same, a close-knit community where people looked out for one another. At the Veterans Center, Arthur was greeted with respect and affection. The staff and younger veterans appreciated his presence, his living link to a war that for many was just a chapter in history books. As he settled into his usual spot at the reception desk, Arthur felt a sense of belonging and purpose that belied his advanced years. Throughout the morning, Arthur lent an ear to those who needed to talk, offered gentle advice when asked, and shared stories of his own experiences. He found particular joy in connecting with a young veteran who was struggling with post-traumatic stress. As they talked, Arthur saw a glimmer of hope return to the young man's eyes, a reminder of why he continued to volunteer despite his own physical limitations. During a quiet moment, Arthur's thoughts drifted to his late wife, Margaret. She had been gone for 5 years now, but her absence still ached like a phantom limb. They had built a life together in Millbrook, raised 2 children who now lived on opposite coasts with families of their own. Arthur missed the companionship, the shared silences, the gentle touch of her hand on his arm. Yet, even in his solitude, Arthur never felt truly alone. The community he had nurtured over the decades had become his extended family. From the staff at the Veterans Center to his neighbors on Cherry Lane, Arthur was surrounded by people who cared for him and valued his presence in their lives. As the lunch hour approached, Arthur prepared to head home. He said his goodbyes to the staff and veterans, promising to return in a few days. The buzzed ride home was quieter, the streets less busy as he made his way back to Cherry Lane. Back at home, Arthur warmed up a bowl of soup and settled in for a quiet afternoon. He picked up the book he'd been reading, a historical novel about World War II. As he read, he found himself comparing the author's depictions to his own memories and those shared by the older veterans he'd known over the years. The afternoon passed peacefully, broken only by a phone call from his daughter in California. They chatted about her children, Arthur's grandchildren, and the latest happenings in their lives. He savored these connections, even as he felt the distance between them acutely. As evening approached, Arthur prepared a simple dinner for himself. He set the table with the same care he would have if Margaret was still with him, using the good china they had received as a wedding gift. It was a small act of dignity and self-respect that he maintained, a way of honoring the life they had built together. After dinner, Arthur took his customary evening walk around the neighborhood. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, a sight that never failed to fill him with a sense of wonder. He nodded to neighbors out walking their dogs or tending to their gardens, exchanging pleasantries and bits of local news. Returning home, Arthur settled into his armchair once more, this time to watch the evening news. He found himself shaking his head at the state of the world, wondering what the future held for his grandchildren and their generation. Yet, even in the face of troubling headlines, Arthur maintained a quiet optimism. He had seen the world change dramatically over his 9 decades, had witnessed humanity's capacity for both great cruelty and incredible kindness. As the day drew to a close, Arthur prepared for bed with the same methodical care he applied to all aspects of his life. He lay in bed, reflecting on the day's events and the life he had lived. There were regrets, of course, choices he wished he could change, words left unsaid, but overall, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the years he had been given. In the darkness of his bedroom, Arthur's thoughts turned to the future. He knew that his time was limited, that each day was a gift not to be taken for granted. Yet he faced this reality not with fear, but with a quiet determination to make the most of whatever time he had left. As sleep began to overtake him, Arthur's last thoughts were of the young veterans he had spoken with that day. He hoped that in some small way he had made a difference in their lives, had offered them a glimpse of the resilience and hope that had carried him through his own darkest times. And so, as the moon rose over Millbrook and the stars twinkled in the clear night sky, Arthur Hawkins drifted off to sleep, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring with the same courage, dignity, and compassion that had defined his long and remarkable life. The bikers' arrival. The peaceful rhythm of Millbrook was shattered on a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. Arthur Hawkins was tending to his garden, carefully pruning his prized roses, when the distant rumble of engines caught his attention. At first, he dismissed it as the sound of a passing truck on the highway, but as the noise grew louder and more insistent, he straightened up, his weathered hand shading his eyes as he peered down the street. What Arthur saw made his heart sink. A convoy of motorcycles, at least 24 strong, thundered into view. The riders, clad in leather jackets emblazoned with a menacing emblem of a snarling wolf, roared past Arthur's house, the noise deafening in the usually quiet neighborhood. The old veteran watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity as the group made its way towards the center of town. As the last bike passed, leaving behind a cloud of exhaust and a lingering echo of revving engines, Arthur's next-door neighbor, Sarah Johnson, hurried over to his fence. "Did you see that, Mr. Hawkins?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I've never seen anything like it in Millbrook before." Arthur nodded gravely. "Can't say that I have either, Sarah. Let's hope they're just passing through." But as the days passed, it became clear that the bikers had no intention of leaving. They had taken over the old abandoned gas station on the edge of town, transforming it into their makeshift headquarters. The once quiet streets of Millbrook now echoed with the constant rumble of motorcycles at all hours of the day and night. At first, the town's residents were merely annoyed by the noise and the disruption to their daily lives. But as the week wore on, more serious concerns began to surface. Reports of petty theft and vandalism started to circulate. The local diner, once a friendly gathering place for the community, became a rowdy hangout for the bikers, driving away its regular patrons. Arthur observed these changes with growing unease. He had seen his fair share of trouble in his long life, both during his time in the military and in the years since, and he recognized the signs of a community under threat. Yet, he also knew the danger of jumping to conclusions or letting fear drive one's actions. On his regular visits to the Veteran Center, Arthur began to hear more stories about the bikers' impact on the town. Young veterans who were struggling to reintegrate into civilian life spoke of feeling intimidated when they went into town. Older veterans, some of whom had mobility issues, expressed frustration at being unable to access their usual haunts due to the bikers' presence. One afternoon, as Arthur was leaving the center, he overheard a conversation between two of the staff members. They were discussing a confrontation that had occurred the previous night at the local bar. Apparently, some of the bikers had gotten into an altercation with a group of young men from town. While no one had been seriously hurt, the incident had left the community shaken. As Arthur made his way home, he pondered the situation. He had always believed in the importance of community and the power of people coming together to face challenges. But he also recognized that this was a delicate situation that required careful handling. That evening, as Arthur sat in his living room, the sound of revving engines once again filled the air. He got up and walked to the window, watching as a group of bikers sped down the street, popping wheelies and weaving dangerously between parked cars. The sight filled him with a mixture of anger and sadness. This was not the Millbrook he knew and loved. The next morning, Arthur decided to take action. He called a meeting of the neighborhood watch group, of which he had been a founding member years ago. The group gathered in his living room, a diverse mix of longtime residents and new arrivals to Millbrook. The concern was palpable as they discussed the situation. "We need to do something," said Tom Foster, the owner of the local hardware store. "These bikers are bad for business. People are afraid to come into town." "But what can we do?" asked Martha Reeves, a retired schoolteacher. "We can't just run them out of town. That could make things worse." Arthur listened to the various opinions, taking in the fear and frustration of his neighbors. When it was his turn to speak, he did so with the measured tone of a man who had seen much in his long life. "We need to approach this carefully," he said. "These bikers are people too, even if their behavior is causing problems. Before we take any drastic action, we need to try to understand the situation better. Maybe there's a way to reach out to them, to find some common ground." His words were met with a mix of skepticism and hope. Some of the younger members of the group seemed eager for more immediate action, but the older residents nodded in agreement with Arthur's cautious approach. As the meeting wrapped up, it was decided that they would start by documenting all incidents involving the bikers, building a case to present to the local authorities if necessary. They also agreed to reach out to other community organizations to form a united front in addressing the issue. Over the next few days, Arthur kept a close eye on the situation. He observed the bikers from a distance, noting their routines and behaviors. He couldn't help but notice that while some of the group seemed to revel in causing trouble, others appeared more reserved, almost uncomfortable with the chaos their presence was creating. One evening, as Arthur was returning from his daily walk, he encountered a young biker working on his motorcycle outside the old gas station. The young man was struggling with a stubborn bolt, frustration evident on his face. Without thinking, Arthur approached him. "Need a hand there, son?" he asked, his voice kind but firm. The biker looked up, surprise and suspicion warring on his face. "What would you know about bikes, old man?" he said, his tone defensive. Arthur chuckled. "I may be old, but I've worked on my fair share of engines in my time. Mind if I take a look?" After a moment's hesitation, the young man nodded, stepping aside. Arthur examined the problem, his experienced eyes quickly identifying the issue. With careful instruction, he guided the biker through the process of loosening the seized bolt. As they worked, Arthur struck up a conversation, asking the young man about himself and how he'd come to be with the biker group. To his surprise, a biker, who introduced himself as Jake, opened up. He spoke of a difficult childhood, of feeling lost and alone until he found a sense of belonging with the bikers. But sometimes, Jake admitted, his voice low, "I wonder if this is really the life I want. Some of the guys, they take things too far, you know." Arthur nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life's full of choices, son. It's never too late to make a change if that's what you want." As they finished the repair, Jake thanked Arthur for his help. There was a new respect in the young man's eyes as he looked at the old veteran. "You're all right, old-timer," he said with a small smile. Not everyone in this town would have stopped to help. Arthur patted Jake on the shoulder. "We're all part of the same community, whether we realize it or not. Sometimes we just need to take the time to see each other as people." As Arthur walked away, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was a way to bridge the gap between the bikers and the town after all. But he also knew that not all encounters would be as positive as this one. His suspicions were confirmed the very next day when he received a call from Sarah Johnson. Her voice was shaky as she told him about an incident at the local park. A group of bikers had intimidated some families, causing a scene that had left children crying and parents outraged. Arthur listened gravely, his heart heavy. It was clear that the situation in Millbrook was reaching a tipping point. Something needed to be done, and soon, before things escalated beyond control. As he hung up the phone, Arthur's mind was racing. He thought of Jake and their conversation, of the fear in Sarah's voice, of the discussions at the Veterans Center. He thought of his own experiences, both in war and in peace, and the lessons he had learned about conflict and resolution. Arthur knew that the next few days would be crucial for Millbrook. The actions taken now would determine whether the town could find a way to coexist with the bikers or whether the situation would devolve into open hostility. As he considered his next move, Arthur felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He may have been 91 years old, but Arthur Hawkins was not one to shy away from a challenge. With renewed determination, he picked up the phone and began to make calls. It was time to rally the community and face this problem head-on. As the sun set on another tumultuous day in Millbrook, Arthur stood at his window, watching the street outside. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of motorcycles, a sound that had become all too familiar. But beneath that noise, he could also hear the sounds of his neighbors, children laughing, dogs barking, the general hum of community life persisting despite the disruption. Arthur smiled to himself. Millbrook had faced challenges before, and it would face this one too. Together, they would find a way forward. With that thought in mind, he turned away from the window and began to prepare for the days ahead, ready to play his part in bringing peace back to the town he loved. Confrontation and crisis. The tension in Millbrook had reached a fever pitch. 2 weeks had passed since the bikers' arrival, and the once peaceful town now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Arthur Hawkins could sense the change in the air as he made his way down Main Street, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Store owners stood guard at their shops, wary eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. Parents hurried their children along, no longer allowing them to linger and play as they once had. The carefree atmosphere that had defined Millbrook for generations had been replaced by an undercurrent of fear and resentment. Arthur's destination that morning was the town hall, where an emergency meeting had been called to address the biker situation. As he approached the building, he could see a crowd gathering, their voices raised in heated discussion. He recognized faces from all corners of the community: business owners, parents, teachers, and even some of the younger veterans he mentored at the center. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. Mayor Eleanor Thompson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, called the meeting to order, but it was clear from the outset that maintaining order would be a challenge. "We need to run these hooligans out of town," shouted Tom Foster, the hardware store owner, his face red with anger. "They're destroying everything we've built here." A chorus of agreement rose from one section of the crowd, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "And how do you propose we do that, Tom?" countered Sarah Johnson, Arthur's neighbor. "We can't just take the law into our own hands. We need to work with the police, find a legal solution." The debate raged on, with various factions arguing for different approaches. Some called for immediate, aggressive action, while others urged caution and diplomacy. Arthur sat quietly, taking it all in, his weathered features creased with concern. When he finally stood to speak, a hush fell over the room. Despite his advanced years, Arthur's presence commanded respect, and all eyes turned to him expectantly. "Friends," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I understand your fear and your anger. I feel it too, but we must be careful not to let those emotions drive us to actions we'll regret. We've faced challenges before, and we've overcome them by standing together, not by turning on each other or resorting to violence." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I've spoken with some of these bikers. Not all of them are here to cause trouble. Some are lost souls, looking for a place to belong. If we approach this situation with understanding and firmness, we may find a solution that doesn't involve running anyone out of town." Arthur's words seemed to have a calming effect on the crowd. Even those who had been calling for drastic action moments before now looked thoughtful. Mayor Thompson seized the moment to propose a plan of action, increased police patrols, community outreach efforts, and a task force to explore long-term solutions. As the meeting adjourned, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps they could find a peaceful resolution after all, but his optimism was short-lived. That very afternoon, as Arthur was returning home from the Veterans Center, he witnessed a confrontation that would change everything. A group of bikers had surrounded a young couple outside the local grocery store. The woman was clutching her purse tightly, fear evident on her face, while her partner stood protectively in front of her. Without hesitation, Arthur quickened his pace, approaching the group with determination. "What seems to be the problem here?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his military years. The bikers turned, surprise registering on their faces at the sight of the elderly man confronting them. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head and multiple tattoos, stepped forward. "This is none of your business, old-timer," he growled. "Why don't you toddle on home before you get hurt?" Arthur stood his ground, his blue eyes flashing with a fire that belied his age. "I may be old, son, but I'm not blind. and I won't stand by while you intimidate innocent people in my town." The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, it seemed as though the situation might escalate into violence. But then, to everyone's surprise, a familiar voice cut through the standoff. "Back off, guys. This man's all right." It was Jake, the young biker Arthur had helped with his motorcycle. He pushed his way through the group, positioning himself between Arthur and the others. The burly biker looked incredulous. "You know this old fossil, Jake?" Jake nodded, his expression resolute. "Yeah, I do. And he's right. This isn't why we came here. Let's just go." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the group began to disperse, shooting dark looks at Arthur as they mounted their bikes and rolled off. As the sound of engines faded, Arthur turned to the young couple. "Are you both all right?" he asked gently. They nodded, shaken but unharmed. After ensuring they had a safe way home, Arthur began his own walk back, his mind troubled by what had transpired. He had only gone a block when he heard the roar of a motorcycle behind him. Turning, he saw Jake pulling up alongside him. "That was a brave thing you did back there, old-timer," Jake said, cutting the engine. "But also pretty stupid. Some of those guys wouldn't think twice about hurting you." Arthur smiled wryly. "I faced worse in my time, son, but I appreciate your concern and your intervention. That couldn't have been easy for you." Jake shrugged, but Arthur could see the conflict in the young man's eyes. "Things are getting out of hand," Jake admitted. "This isn't what I signed up for when I joined the crew, but I don't know how to make it stop." Arthur placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "It takes courage to stand up for what's right, especially to your friends. You've taken the first step today. Remember, there's always a choice, always a way out if you want it badly enough." As Jake rode away, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was just the beginning. His instincts, honed by years of military service and life experience, told him that a crisis point was approaching. That night, as Arthur prepared for bed, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet evening. He moved to his window, watching as police cars sped down the street towards the center of town. In the distance, he could see an orange glow lighting up the sky. With a sense of dread, Arthur dressed quickly and made his way outside. Neighbors were emerging from their homes, faces etched with worry as they gazed towards the commotion. Sarah Johnson hurried over to him, her voice breathless with shock. "Arthur, it's the community center," she gasped. "It's on fire." The news hit Arthur like a physical blow. The community center was the heart of Millbrook, a place where people of all ages gathered for events, classes, and support groups. It was also where he spent much of his time volunteering with fellow veterans. As he stood there, watching the glow of the fire and listening to the wail of sirens, Arthur felt a profound sense of loss and anger. This was no accident, he was certain of that. The situation had escalated beyond anything he had feared. In that moment, Arthur Hawkins knew that the time for cautious diplomacy had passed. The very fabric of his beloved community was under attack, and he could no longer stand idly by. Despite his age, despite the risks, he knew he had to take action. As neighbors gathered on the street, their voices a mix of fear and outrage, Arthur's mind was already formulating a plan. He thought of his old military contacts, of the networks he had built over decades of community service. He thought of Jake and the other bikers who might not be fully committed to this path of destruction. With a deep breath, Arthur straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settling upon them. He had hoped to spend his twilight years in peace, but fate had other plans. Now he would need to draw upon every ounce of courage, wisdom, and strength he had accumulated over his long life. As the first light of dawn began to break over Millbrook, casting an eerie glow through the lingering smoke, Arthur made a solemn vow. He would find a way to end this crisis and restore peace to his town, no matter the cost. The battle for Millbrook's soul had begun, and Arthur Hawkins was ready to lead the charge. The call for help. The morning after the community center fire, Millbrook was shrouded in a pall of smoke and despair. Arthur Hawkins sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling before him, untouched. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone, his resolve strengthening with each passing moment. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, one he hoped never to need again. As the phone rang, Arthur's mind drifted back to a time long ago, to jungles and battlefields, to bonds forged in the crucible of war. "Hello," a gruff voice answered on the third ring. Arthur took a deep breath. "General Harding, it's Arthur Hawkins." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a bark of laughter. "Arthur, I'll be damned. It's been, 20 years?" 23, Arthur corrected, a faint smile crossing his lips despite the gravity of the situation. "Listen, James, I need your help. My town is in trouble." Over the next half hour, Arthur laid out the situation in Millbrook. He spoke of the bikers' arrival, the escalating tensions, and finally, the burning of the community center. General James Harding listened in silence, only occasionally asking for clarification. When Arthur finished, the general's voice was grim. "Sounds like you've got a real powder keg there, old friend. What exactly are you asking of me?" Arthur hesitated, knowing that his next words would set in motion events that could change Millbrook forever. "I need your influence, James, your connections. This is bigger than our local police can handle, but I don't want this to turn into a military operation. These aren't foreign combatants. They're our own people, however misguided. We need a delicate touch." General Harding sighed heavily. "You're asking for a lot, Arthur, but I owe you my life 3 times over. Give me 48 hours. I'll make some calls, pull some strings. In the meantime, keep your head down and your eyes open." As Arthur hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Help was coming, but would it be enough? And more importantly, would it arrive in time? The next 2 days were a blur of activity. The town was on edge, with impromptu neighborhood watch groups patrolling the streets. The bikers had retreated to their makeshift headquarters at the old gas station, emerging only in small groups, their previous bravado replaced by wary glances and muttered threats. Arthur split his time between coordinating with local leaders and reaching out to a few bikers, like Jake, who seemed open to dialogue. It was exhausting work for a man of his age, but Arthur pushed on, driven by a sense of duty that had defined his entire life. On the morning of the second day, as Arthur was preparing to head out for another round of meetings, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a man in a crisp suit, his bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian attire. "Mr. Hawkins, I'm Agent Carver with the FBI. General Harding sent me. May I come in?" Arthur ushered the agent inside, relief washing over him. As they sat in his living room, Agent Carver outlined the plan that had been set in motion. "We've been monitoring this biker group for some time," Carver explained. "They're part of a larger organization involved in various illegal activities across several states. What's happening here in Millbrook is just the tip of the iceberg." Arthur listened intently as Carver detailed the operation. A joint task force of FBI agents and state police was being assembled, ready to move in and dismantle the biker gang's operation. But they needed local cooperation to ensure things went smoothly and to minimize the risk of violence. "That's where you come in, Mr. Hawkins," Carver said, leaning forward. "We need someone the town trusts to help coordinate our efforts on the ground. Someone who can keep people calm and prevent any vigilant actions that might complicate our operation." Arthur nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. "I'll do whatever is necessary to protect my town, Agent Carver, but I have one condition." Carver raised an eyebrow, waiting. "There's a young man named Jake," Arthur continued. "He's part of the biker group, but he's different. I believe he wants out. I want assurances that if he cooperates, he'll be given a chance to turn his life around." Agent Carver considered this for a moment before nodding. "If he's willing to cooperate and provide information, we can work something out, but he'll need to make that choice himself." As Agent Carver left, Arthur felt a renewed sense of purpose. He immediately set to work, discreetly contacting key members of the community, the mayor, the police chief, leaders of various community organizations. Each was briefed on the situation and given specific tasks to help prepare for the coming operation. Meanwhile, Arthur also reached out to Jake, arranging a clandestine meeting at the edge of town. As the young biker approached, his face etched with worry, Arthur felt a surge of paternal concern. "Things are coming to a head, son," Arthur said without preamble. "I can't give you details, but I can offer you a way out. If you're willing to cooperate with the authorities, share what you know about the gang's activities, there's a chance for you to start over." Jake's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and hope. "You don't understand, old man. These guys, they don't take kindly to traitors. If I talk..." Arthur placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "I give you my word, you'll be protected. But you have to make this choice for yourself. Think about the future you want, the man you want to be." As Jake rode away, visibly wrestling with the decision before him, Arthur turned his attention to the town. Over the next 24 hours, he worked tirelessly, moving from one meeting to another, always projecting an aura of calm determination that seemed to inspire those around him. In quiet conversations and impassioned speeches, Arthur reminded his neighbors of the town's strength, its history of coming together in times of crisis. He urged patience and restraint, hinting at a resolution without revealing the details of the coming operation. The night before the planned raid, Arthur found himself unable to sleep. He sat in his darkened living room, gazing out at the quiet street, his mind racing with all that could go wrong. The stakes were impossibly high. The future of Millbrook, the lives of his neighbors, the fate of young men like Jake who had lost their way. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, Arthur rose from his chair, his joints protesting the movement after hours of stillness. He made his way to the closet and pulled out an old, battered footlocker. Inside, carefully preserved, was his old military uniform. Arthur ran his fingers over the faded fabric, the memories of his service washing over him. He had hoped never to see battle again, but life, it seemed, had other plans. This time, the battlefield was his beloved town, and the enemy was not a foreign power, but the fear and mistrust that had taken root in Millbrook's soul. With slow, deliberate movements, Arthur began to dress. He wasn't putting on the uniform that wouldn't be appropriate for what lay ahead. But as he donned his most respectable suit, he felt the same sense of purpose, the same commitment to duty that had driven him all those years ago. Fully dressed, Arthur stood before the mirror, straightening his tie. The face that looked back at him was lined with age, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. He was no longer just Arthur Hawkins, the kindly old veteran. Today, he was a soldier once more, standing on the front lines in the battle for Millbrook's future. As he stepped out into the cool morning air, Arthur's resolve was ironclad. Whatever challenges the day might bring, he would face them head-on. The call for help had been answered, and now it was time to reclaim his town from the shadows that had fallen over it. With a deep breath, Arthur set off down the street, ready to play his part in the drama that was about to unfold. The fate of Millbrook hung in the balance, and Arthur Hawkins was determined to tip the scales in favor of justice, peace, and the community he loved. Unexpected allies. The day of reckoning dawned over Millbrook, the rising sun casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Arthur Hawkins stood at his front window, watching as the town slowly came to life, its residents unaware of the storm about to break. A soft knock at the door pulled Arthur from his vigil. He opened it to find Sarah Johnson, her face etched with concern. "Arthur, something's happening. There are strangers in town, and I saw several unmarked vans near the old factory district." Arthur nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Sarah. Things are coming to a head, but we're not alone in this fight. I need you to spread the word quietly. Tell everyone to stay indoors today if they can. If not, go about their business as usual, but be alert." As Sarah hurried off to complete her task, Arthur made his way towards the town center. He had a crucial role to play in the coming hours, and he couldn't afford to let his age or his fears slow him down. At the corner of Main Street, Arthur was surprised to see a familiar face. Jake, the young biker he befriended. The young man looked pale and nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "Jake," Arthur called softly, beckoning him over. "Have you made your decision?" Jake nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm in, old-timer. I can't be part of this anymore. But I'm scared. These guys, they're not going to go down without a fight." Arthur squeezed Jake's shoulder, his voice firm but kind. "You're doing the right thing, son. There are people here who can protect you. Come with me." Together, they made their way to the police station, where Agent Carver was waiting. As Jake was ushered inside to give his statement, Arthur couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The young man had chosen a difficult path, but one that offered hope for redemption. As the morning wore on, tension in the town grew palpable. Residents who had ventured out found themselves politely but firmly directed away from certain areas by stern-faced men and women who were clearly not local law enforcement. At precisely 10 a.m., all hell broke loose. The sound of screeching tires and shouted commands shattered the uneasy calm. From his vantage point near the town hall, Arthur watched as a coordinated operation unfolded with military precision. FBI agents and state police descended on the old gas station and several other locations simultaneously. But the bikers weren't going down without a fight. The roar of motorcycles filled the air as some attempted to flee, leading to high-speed chases through the streets of Millbrook. Others barricaded themselves in buildings, shouting defiance and threats. Arthur's heart raced as he saw the situation spiraling towards potential violence. This was the moment he had been preparing for. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out into the street, his presence commanding attention even amidst the chaos. "Stop this madness," he shouted, his voice carrying with surprising strength. "This is not who we are, any of us." To everyone's amazement, the commotion seemed to pause. Both law enforcement and bikers turned to look at the elderly man standing fearlessly in their midst. Arthur continued, his words directed at the cornered bikers. "I know you came here looking for something. Freedom, brotherhood, a place to belong. But this path leads nowhere good. Look around you. This town could be a home for you, a place to start over, if you'd only give it a chance." He then turned to the law enforcement officers. "And you, remember that your job is to protect and serve. These men are citizens too. No matter their mistakes, they deserve justice, not vengeance." For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling down the empty street. Then, slowly, miraculously, weapons were lowered. Bikers began to emerge from their hideouts, hands raised in surrender. As the situation de-escalated, Arthur found himself at the center of a gathering crowd. Residents who had been watching from behind locked doors now ventured out, drawn by the sight of their elderly neighbor standing tall amidst the chaos. Mayor Thompson pushed her way through the crowd, her face a mixture of awe and concern. "Arthur, what you did was incredibly dangerous and incredibly brave. But how did you know what to say?" Arthur smiled warily. "I've seen conflict, Eleanor. I've seen what happens when people forget their shared humanity. Sometimes, all it takes is someone to remind them." As the law enforcement officers began processing the arrested bikers, Arthur noticed a commotion near one of the police vans. An older biker, his leather vest marked with patches denoting his high rank in the gang, was shouting at Jake, who stood nearby with Agent Carver. "You traitor! You sold us out!" the older biker yelled, struggling against his restraints. Arthur moved quickly, positioning himself between Jake and the angry biker. "He made a choice," Arthur said firmly. "A choice to be better than the path you set him on. That doesn't make him a traitor. It makes him brave." The older biker spat on the ground, but fell silent, glaring at Arthur with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. As the dust began to settle, Arthur found himself surrounded by a group of townspeople. Tom Foster, the hardware store owner who had been one of the loudest voices calling for aggressive action against the bikers, approached Arthur with tears in his eyes. "I was wrong, Arthur," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I was so angry, so scared, I couldn't see any other way. But you showed us there's always another path." Others joined in, expressing their gratitude and admiration for Arthur's actions. Sarah Johnson hugged him tightly, whispering, "You save our town, Mr. Hawkins." But Arthur shook his head. "No, we all save our town. Every one of you who chose patience over violence, understanding over fear. We remembered who we are today." As the crowd dispersed and the cleanup began, Arthur found himself standing with Jake and a small group of younger bikers who had chosen to surrender peacefully. "What happens to us now?" one of them asked, fear and uncertainty clear in his voice. Arthur looked at them each in turn, seeing not hardened criminals, but lost young men in need of guidance. "That depends on you," he said gently. "You have a choice to make. This town has been hurt, but it's also forgiving. If you're willing to make amends, to be part of rebuilding what's been broken, I believe you'll find a community here ready to give you a second chance." Jake stepped forward, his face set with determination. "I'm staying," he announced. "I want to make things right." One by one, the other young bikers nodded their agreement. Arthur felt a warmth spreading through his chest. This was more than just the end of a crisis. It was the beginning of healing, of transformation. As the sun began to set on one of the most tumultuous days in Millbrook's history, Arthur made his way slowly home. He was exhausted, every joint aching, but his heart was full. The town had faced its greatest challenge and emerged stronger, more united. Reaching his front porch, Arthur paused to look back at the town he called home for so long. The streets were quiet now, but he could see lights on in houses all along the block, knew that people would be coming together, sharing their experiences, finding comfort in each other. Arthur smiled to himself. Millbrook had always been a special place, but now it had proven its strength, its capacity for forgiveness and growth. As he entered his home, Arthur knew that the story of today would be told for generations to come, a story of a town that found unexpected allies in its hour of need, and of an old veteran who reminded everyone of the power of compassion and courage. Resolution and reflection. In the weeks following the dramatic confrontation, Millbrook underwent a remarkable transformation. The physical scars of the biker occupation began to heal as the community came together to repair damaged buildings and clean up the streets. But more profound was the change in the town's spirit, a newfound sense of unity and purpose that seemed to infuse every interaction. At the center of this renaissance was Arthur Hawkins. Despite his attempts to downplay his role, the town had embraced him as a hero, a living embodiment of the values they aspired to uphold. Arthur found himself busier than he had been in years, his wisdom and experience sought after by young and old alike. One crisp autumn morning, Arthur made his way to the site of the old community center. The charred ruins had been cleared away, and in their place stood the skeleton of a new building. As he approached, Arthur saw a familiar figure among the construction workers, Jake, the young biker who had chosen to stay and make amends. "Morning, old-timer," Jake called out, wiping sweat from his brow as he came over to greet Arthur. "What do you think of our progress?" Arthur surveyed the site, a smile creasing his weathered features. "It's coming along beautifully, son. You should be proud." Jake nodded, his eyes bright with purpose. "I am. We all are. It feels good, you know. Building something instead of tearing it down." As they talked, Arthur noticed other former bikers working alongside longtime residents. The sight warmed his heart. It hadn't been an easy road. There had been mistrust and resentment to overcome on both sides. But with patience and perseverance, real bonds were forming. "Mr. Hawkins," a voice called out. Arthur turned to see Sarah Johnson approaching, a clipboard in hand. "I'm glad I caught you. We're finalizing plans for the new center's programs, and we'd love your input." Arthur spent the next hour in animated discussion with Sarah and several other community leaders. They envisioned a space that would serve all segments of the population: after-school programs for children, job training for young adults, support groups for veterans, and social activities for seniors. As the meeting wrapped up, Mayor Thompson pulled Arthur aside. "We've received some unexpected help," she said, her voice low with excitement. "Remember that call you made? Well, it seems General Harding was impressed by how we handled things. He's used his influence to secure federal funding for community development projects here in Millbrook." Arthur's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he chuckled. James always did know how to pull strings. The mayor squeezed his arm gratefully. "This is going to make a real difference, Arthur. We can expand the community center, improve our schools, maybe even start that small business incubator we've been dreaming about." As Arthur made his way home that afternoon, he found himself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past few months. The town he loved had been pushed to the brink, faced with a challenge that could have torn it apart. Instead, Millbrook had emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more united than ever before. Passing by the local diner, Arthur noticed a group of teenagers gathered outside. Among them were some of the local kids who had initially been most fearful of the bikers, now laughing and chatting with a couple of the younger ex-gang members. They waved as Arthur passed, calling out greetings filled with genuine warmth and respect. At home, Arthur eased himself into his favorite armchair, his joints protesting after the busy day. His gaze fell on the photographs lining his mantelpiece, snapshots of a long life filled with both joy and hardship. There was his wedding photo with Margaret, pictures of their children and grandchildren, images from his military service. A new photo had joined the collection, a candid shot taken at the groundbreaking ceremony for the new community center. In it, Arthur stood surrounded by a diverse group of townspeople, his face alight with pride and hope. As the evening deepened into night, Arthur found himself pondering the strange twists of fate that had led him to this point. He had lived through wars, seen the best and worst of humanity, experienced personal triumphs and heartbreaking losses. Yet somehow, in his twilight years, he had found himself at the heart of a different kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with words, wisdom, and unwavering compassion. A soft knock at the door roused Arthur from his reverie. Opening it, he found Jake standing on his porch, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Hawkins," Jake said, shifting from foot to foot. I wanted to thank you. For believing in me when no one else did. For showing me there was another way to live." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. "You don't need to thank me, son. You made the choice. You did the hard work. I'm just glad I was here to see it." Jake nodded, blinking back tears. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about finding purpose. I decided to apply to college. Thought maybe I could study social work, Try to help other kids who were lost like I was." Arthur's face broke into a wide smile. "That's wonderful news, Jake. You'll make a fine social worker." As Jake left, his steps lighter and his shoulders straighter, Arthur felt a profound sense of fulfillment wash over him. This, he realized, was why he had survived when so many of his comrades have fallen. This was the purpose that had driven him all these years, to be a beacon of hope, a source of strength for those who needed it most. In the days and weeks that followed, Arthur watched with joy as Millbrook continued to flourish. The new community center opened its doors, quickly becoming a hub of activity and connection. The town's economy began to rebound as new businesses opened, attracted by the sense of vibrancy and community spirit. 1 year to the day after the confrontation that had changed everything, Millbrook held a town-wide celebration. As Arthur made his way through the festivities, he was continuously stopped by people wanting to shake his hand, share a story, or simply express their gratitude. The highlight of the day came when Mayor Thompson unveiled a new plaque outside the community center. It read, "Dedicated to Arthur Hawkins, veteran, leader, friend. His courage and compassion showed us the way forward." As applause erupted around him, Arthur felt overwhelmed by emotion. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, old friends and new, young and old, from all walks of life, and saw in them the very best of humanity. In that moment, Arthur Hawkins knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Millbrook would face them together. The town had found its strength, its heart, and its soul, and though he was in the winter of his years, Arthur felt a spring-like sense of renewal and hope. As the sun set on the celebration, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Arthur stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. He thought of all the twists and turns his long life had taken, all the battles fought and lessons learned, and he smiled, knowing that here, in this small town he called home, he had finally found the peace and purpose he had sought for so long. The story of Millbrook's transformation would be told for generations to come, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of community. And at the heart of that story would always be Arthur Hawkins, the 91-year-old veteran who had reminded an entire town of the strength that lies within each of us, waiting to be awakened in times of need. As Arthur made his way home that evening, surrounded by the warmth and love of his community, he felt a deep sense of contentment. He had lived a long and full life, faced countless challenges, and now, in his twilight years, he had played a part in writing a new chapter of hope and redemption. With each step, Arthur silently reaffirmed the promise he had made to himself and to Millbrook, to continue being a source of wisdom, strength, and compassion for as long as he drew breath. For in this small town that had faced its demons and emerged stronger, Arthur Hawkins had found not just a home, but a legacy that would endure long after he was gone.